Before we get into this video's content, let's do some math. How is this related to cubing? The big square is your cube, the small square is your corner piece, and the circle is the distance at which your corner stock can stick out. Here we are assuming zero thickness to the corner stock and sticking it out to the maximum distance possible. Let's extract some information we know first. First, the radius of the circle is x over 2, which gives us the distance from center to h to corner, and this diagonal. Now we can use the Pythagoras theorem, but since all triangles here are right-angled isosceles, let me just shortcut it for you and conclude that all diagonals are square root 2 times the length of either side. From here we can conclude that the diagonal of the small square is square root 2. Now we can write two expressions for the diagonal of the big blue triangle. First, it is square root 2 times bigger than either of its other two sides. Therefore, square root 2 times x over 2 gives us x over root 2. Next, it is just the sum of the radius of the circle and the diagonal of the small square, giving us root 2 plus x over 2. Equate the two sides, start solving for x, and we get a value of 6.83. Going back to what x actually means, we can conclude that the cube must be less than 6.83 times the size of its own outer layer.
After the math lesson comes the history lesson. Since 7 is a bigger number than 6.83, for 7 by 7 cubes and beyond, there's going to be no room for the corners to attach to the inner mechanism of the cube. The first mass-produced 7 by 7, the V cube, uses a pillow design which expanded the middle to accommodate the corner in half turn. The convex design, however, made the grip very suboptimal for finger tricks and speed cubing, and it also made the cube not a cube anymore. The second mass-produced major 7x7, the Shengshuo, uses a wide outer layer which expands the whole outer layer instead of just the middle to maintain the cubic shape. As a happy coincidence, solving big cubes often use a reduction method or a variant of it that is very heavy on outer layer turns, and especially during edge pairing and 3x3 stage, the wide outer layer makes the grip so much better compared to a proportional cube, let alone a payload cube, that modern manufacturers not only made the outer layers way bigger than what is the minimum necessary, but cubes such as 5x5 and 6x6, which are below that 6.83 number and therefore don't need wide outer layers, they're still manufactured with wide outer layers because the handling is just a lot better. Another alternative to the wide outer layer is explored by Preston Puzzles in his 49x49, where he made the cut lines come out of the cube slanted. This means that at the point of exiting the cube, the cut lines actually don't violate the 6.83 number, but the further away you go, the outer layer becomes smaller. Revolving this slanted line along an axis gives you a cone, and this produces a curvy cut known as the Ozing effect. I'm unable to find a convincing source of the origin of this term or who exactly it's named after, but it is a very old term that showed up in cuboid making, where people actually just take a mass-produced cube and glue some of the outer pieces together, which reduces it into a non-proportional cuboid, and then to try to make it more proportional by shaving down the pieces. Sometimes when they shave it, they shave into the slanted part of the cut lines. In 2010, XV27, designer of the most dominant even cube alignment mechanism, released two videos showing a proportional 7x7. The first was a checkered pattern which, unlike the stage performances of Tony Fisher's 9x9 or 100x100, this was performed in a single cut. The second video was even more convincing that the puzzle was fully functional, showcased a full solve. However, he never revealed how he achieved this to the public. In 2023, Jacob Cubing found an alternative strategy using what he called a squircle cut and flexible corner stocks, and he used this strategy to make a proportional 7x7 and an 8x8, and he reviewed this mechanism because he believed in sharing the knowledge. Jacob's 7x7 is the true proportional 7x7, while mine is sort of a fake. The only special thing about mine was that I UV coated over the stickers to prevent chipping, and I magnetized it, also with a ball core. My 7x7 itself has its own history. In 2022, I had a previous attempt at making this puzzle, but due to its poor performance, I never stickered it or made a full video. It only made a short cameo in my Tianxiong Solar S5 video. Being relatively inexperienced in 3D printing back then, I made a handful of mistakes that barely affected the tolerances among the pieces of the puzzle, resulting in a barely functional puzzle with weak pieces that break easily. As you can see now, the puzzle is practically in pieces. The current cube is almost an exact remake of the original, down to the strategy used to make it look like a proportional 7x7, but with better knowledge of 3D printing and a better 3D printer. Given the failure of the original, I'm not going to call this a version 2. Instead, it's more like attempt 2 at version 1. The strategies that I used to make this look like a proportional 7x7 are actually very lame. I just took two existing ideas, namely wide outer layer and oozing, and I balanced them on a thread to hit a minimum point between both of these features, and then I did some extra cuts. The main two cuts I did was cutting the midges and the inner wings a little bit smaller on the outside, so you can see a little bit of a hole here. Here it should be a bit more prominent. The original attempt at this puzzle was 65mm with a 10mm outer layer and a 9mm inner. However, this one is actually a bit smaller. So this is officially 61.5mm in the design files with 9.5mm outer layer and an 8.5mm inner. Though practically printing, it turned out 62.5mm, which is exactly the same size as the Chi Warrior 7x7. If you were to do the math, the original puzzle will have an inner to outer layer ratio of 6.5, whereas the current attempt at it would have 6.47, both of which are actually below the 6.83 number. In retrospect, if I really wanted to be a perfectionist, I could have designed this cube to be truly proportional, which will make the oozing worse, but then go and buy some guitar picks that are flexible enough, cut them into squares and super glue them over the obliques and the T-centers. So assuming that I go with this flexible cap design, the caps will not bulge out because of how I cut the midges and the inner wings. However, when it comes to pieces that cannot be cut, like the corners and the outer wings, when the cube is turned, that will make the flexible caps bulge out. And then when the cube goes back into alignment, the flexible caps will snap back into the flat shape. With my initial attempt, which is the failed version in 2022, I actually got into some discussion with Jacob Cubing, and I actually suggested that he can use my design but use the flexible T-center concept to cover up the oozing holes. However, he later just invented his own way, making the corners flexible instead. So the flexible parts came to the outer layer instead of the middle layer. This is his idea entirely. I have no contribution in it. And on the other hand, like, especially given the limits of my Ender 2 Pro, I initially put the project to rest, but when I upgraded my 3D printer, I had a few puzzle ideas in mind, and bringing this dead project back to life was one of those ideas. One major headache about manufacturing this puzzle is print orientation. Due to how FDM printing works, anything along the Z-axis is significantly weaker than the X and Y-axis. And considering how thin big cube parts can be, a bad choice of print orientation can result in parts that are so weak that the forces involved in ripping them off the print bed or ripping the support material off the piece is enough to break the part. Additionally, you cannot print in mid-air. A support structure has to be printed under the overhangs, which not only wastes plastic, but it also leaves behind residue that may affect the dimensional accuracy of your part. So I had to decide on a print orientation for every piece that minimizes the support material and doesn't get the Z-axis to cut through the weakest point of the piece. Moving on to the small pieces, which are these few, the problem gets even worse. This is where the feet of the pieces are really small and it becomes near impossible to print them without support material. And also, every one of these piece types appears 24 times in the entire cube, so any minor error you make is going to get multiplied many more times compared to the big pieces. The X centers are probably the easiest to print in a way that eliminates any weak points. Just print them side on 45 degrees. This results in a full Z-axis slice that actually cross-sections the entire profile of the piece itself. The T-centers can be printed with a flat face down and having support material under the wings. For this piece in particular, it's stuck to the print bed over a large surface area and the connection neck is relatively narrow, at least from this side. Of course, it's wider from this side. But I actually broke it a few times when trying to remove it from the print bed, and what I settled for eventually was to first chamfer it to make it easier to come off, and also added a bit of anti-stick design, a bit hard to see, but you can see a few rails here. These are not anti-stick to reduce friction as you know in speed cubes, but it's anti-stick to the print bed obliques, and it's a unique big cube part that 4x4 and 5x5 don't have. And this piece is terrible. It's the worst piece of them all. In speed cubing, it's also the most likely piece to pop or get deforming lockups, and the Aosu style double anchor cuts definitely help to reduce the chance of this piece popping out, but as you can see, it also causes the piece to twist in all sorts of directions. In fact, it looks like a snake that twists in 3 different dimensions, which is a huge problem because no matter how you want to protect 2 weak spots on 2 different dimensions and slice the piece, there will always be a third dimension where this piece is going to get chopped. So I went with a very strange and creative 45-degree slant orientation, which not only allowed the head to be printed with no supports, but the weak spots itself also cut at 45-degree angle, which makes the surface area bigger than any of those 90-degree cut options. Just like the maglev 5x5 V2, the 7x7 is actually built with a center shaft big enough to accommodate ring magnets. However, I didn't have any more ring magnets at the point in time when making this cube, so I built it on springs. But now that this just came in, it's time to make the claim.
Hello, I'm Sandy. Welcome to the pharmacy. May I know your name and I see, do you have any allergies? What's your current medical therapy? The dose, the route, the frequency, any small drink, traditional remedy, any comorbidity, Tatenolol and Lodipine, ciprofloxacin or cephalexin, pseudohyperdrinephenolamide. These are things you shouldn't be mixing. Wake up, my friend. There's no time to snooze. Lies are at stake. You can make a wrong move. Wake up, my friend. There's no time to lose. Go and get some caffeine if you need a boost.
Now I can officially claim to have a maglev 7x7. It's ridiculously loose right now, so I'll probably have to tension it more and tension it tighter. Notice my screws actually go way further in compared to when they are springs. And wow, actually that's not bad. That's really not bad. It's pretty fast. Except the corner cutting is pretty terrible because of how square this thing is. Turning is pretty nice. It's pretty fast. It's smooth. Yeah, let me just check about it. The proof. There is a fully functional maglev 7x7. Yeah, I'll probably not put the caps back in this clip because this cube needs further tensioning, but yep, here's the demo of the fully functional maglev 7x7. The actual mechanism of my 7x7 isn't too special. It's just another 2-shell cube with a ball core, and the inner shell itself is a 3x3 with a stockless center design. So the stabilizer for this 3x3 is within the upper part of the shaft, just like how a modern 3x3 is built. This whole concept is just recycled from my maglev 5x5 V2, which is in turn just a slight modification of the maglev 5x5 V1 from. The center cap design is something that I also recycled from my maglev 5x5 V2, which again is a slight repurpose of the V1. However, I didn't really talk about it much during both of the videos of my maglev 5x5, so I'm going to talk about it now. It draws inspiration from the Ultron GTS WRM and V6, where the cap itself hooks under the other pieces, so you can. Okay, let me just disassemble this cube a little bit. It's actually quite difficult to take out the cap unless I pluck out like 2 pieces and then slide this thing away and then dig underneath. Yep. Basically, I have to unhook the cap from the surrounding pieces. However, when it's surrounded in 4 directions, it's very hard to do so. So usually I will have to take out a few pieces, and doing so actually doesn't stress any of the parts because it's not like plucking it out or what. It's really just unhooking it. Jumping slightly earlier in this video, where you go back to the clip where I swapped out all the springs of this 7x7 into maglev, I actually did it with one of the edges taken out to change the face because I don't want to keep putting back and taking out more edges. I did like 4B, 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 4B to assess all the remaining centers. For the front and back centers, I did like 4L, 4L2. And if you want to do such a spring swap to an even layer cube, you can. You just need to make sure the alignment mechanism is in the back left, so that when you do this is 8x8, so when you do B, the inner layer drags along with it, so this becomes 5B. So here's the cap of the 7x7. Underneath the cap, there's actually a flap that goes in all 4 directions, which makes it quite difficult to pop out. And as an extra fail-safe, I actually designed the center cap to have a hole at the bottom so that in case this design doesn't work well enough and it doesn't stay into the cube, I will push a magnet into this hole and glue it right there, and the magnet will attract the screw. I put this hole inside for both the 5x5 and the 7x7, and neither of them do I actually need to glue a magnet in, like so far. And of course, as mentioned earlier, the shaft for the centerpiece is really fat because it's meant to house a pair of ring magnets. One other major difference between my 7x7 and majority of the past cubes that I did was that I actually used spherical geometry to design this 7x7. And a cylinder is different when you rotate it in different axes. Basically both a square and a circle depending on which direction you're looking at or which way you rotate it. And because of that, when you overlap multiple cylinders together, they don't exactly intersect and you get lines of intersection. So for example, there's a ridge here. You can see two little flaps on the side here. I think it's more prominent in the difference between the Shengshou and the V-Cube. Here's one of my last few surviving Shengshous and V-Cubes. Very obviously on the Shengshou 5x5, there's two flaps here. On the corner you can tell that there's originally supposed to be a ridge here, but you can tell it's not that shiny because I sanded it so the ridge becomes less prominent, but you can tell that there was once a ridge there and then I sanded over it. The Moyu cubes and the Shengshou cubes and pretty much most of the Chinese manufactured speed cubes from 2010 until now, majority of them have cylindrical designs, and all those flaps and extra hooks that you see, they're actually really good because they help to prevent pops. This piece has two extra wings on the side to keep it in. As compared to a V-Cube, which is a spherical cube, it does not have it. Which is going on to what the V-Cube actually is. It's a cube built around spherical geometry, which is how I designed this 7x7 as well. So the advantage to spherical geometry is just that it has less features, so there's less room for your 3D printer to make something wrong. Spears, no matter how you rotate them, they look the same. So there's no intersection lines and no extra flaps for like all those intersection features. So if you can look at my corner here, I designed my cube with spherical geometry and you can see the corner is totally smooth, no ridge on the side. And likewise, when I get the corner out, you can see the corner is part of a spear. It's not part of three intersecting cylinders. However, the V-Cube is a single anchored cube, so you can tell that some of these pieces are very flat from the side profile, whereas my cube is double anchored. Except the geometry is similar to the V-Cube, but the mechanism is more similar to the Aosu. Because it has two anchors, the neighboring piece also twists around the anchors, so it sort of forms this shape. And my wings are actually not as defenseless against popping like the V-Cube wings are, because with a single anchored cube, the side is just two straight lines that you can just unhook from one direction and pretty much take it out. As for these two, it actually has a side flap on the side. You can tell that it has flaps on the side. That's because it wraps around the top anchor here. It's virtually at the same height as the top one of the two anchors. Because of that, it's not easy to unhook these two pieces straight from the cube. Even more obvious is the oblique pieces. Like the V-Cube one is a lot simpler, whereas mine still has quite a lot of features of curling around the other anchor. So I slightly mentioned this earlier in the video, so it makes it much harder to pop, but also a lot more difficult to 3D print and orient on the print bed, and I have to come up with that ridiculous orientation just for it. As for the actual performance of this cube, this is where I'm going to deviate from my script, because I originally wrote a script based on how this cube performs with springs, but after swapping it to maglev, it's actually significantly better. With springs, I actually had an issue where when I turn it, like at the beginning of each outer layer turn, I find that the cube is a bit catchier, and like it's difficult to start a turn but easy to continue on to a turn. I actually do not experience this issue with maglev at all, which is a huge save. The turning has a rather flat, smooth feel, and the puzzle still feels quite stable. And by smooth, I mean there's no bumping of the pieces. It feels totally flat. Of course, the plastic itself, since this is 3D printed, is rough and scratchy. It's not like mass-produced puzzle. But it's really smooth for what it is. The second and third layers are a little less smooth than the outer, and they don't corner cut as well because they're much more square. I'm also going for the look partly. One major difference between this cube and I would say the majority of the past cubes that I made is that with the past cubes that I made, I actually used the same magnetic strength throughout. And sometimes when I turn the outer layer, it actually causes the cube to flex because the outer magnet is pulling the remaining layers a little bit at the beginning of its turn. And once I separate the outer magnet like far enough, then the remaining magnets will rebound this back into cube shape, and then the turn continues. I found this much less prominent with this cube because of a change in the magnet layout, which is I still use the same magnetic strength all of the inner layers, and even this one here, but the corner has been replaced with a smaller and weaker magnet, so this attraction between this outer pair is weaker than all the inners. And because of that, the outer layer's ability to unintentionally pull the neighboring layers along with it is very much reduced, and I do find that the unnecessary flexing caused by the outer layer magnets being too strong does not really exist on this cube. There's also another annoying problem where sometimes when I'm turning this cube, in particular the inner X center, this piece here, 3x3 on both sides, like it will twist. Sometimes when I turn the second layer, it will cause it will catch onto a neighboring piece on the third layer, which is always this piece, or like this type of piece, and it will cause it to twist. I can't spontaneously make one happen, but it's quite annoying and it happens relatively often. These stickers are not just the Shengshu shades, they are actual Shengshu stickers. Because when you buy certain cubes such as the Shengshu 8x8, which is actually where these stickers came from, like it actually comes with spare sheets. And I did re-sticker my Shengshu 8, but it's not with the spare sheets that came with it. It was with just an overall brighter shades, because back in the day we would criticize these shades for being dull and not good for recognition. So actually the majority of in fact all my Shengshu big cubes have been re-stickered. Like down from like my 5x5 and 4x4, I actually never bought the Shengshu 6x6. And I used to have a Shengshu 7x7. I actually re-stickered that one also, and I tried to mod it into a 5x5x7. I no longer had that Shengshu 7 with me. The only two cubes that I sort of have that still have the classic scheme are the Shengshu 2x2 and the Taiyan Zanci. So in a way, it's kind of refreshing and a bit of a memory trip back to this color scheme, and like yeah, it's mainly for the retro look that this puzzle has. For projects such as proportional 7x7, I feel like this look also goes really well, because like if I want to go for the modern look, white outer layer is the way to go. Whereas for a classic look, obviously I think like these shades, this layer sizing goes with the aesthetics of this cube overall. So overall, I'm quite pleased with this puzzle. Not as a speed cube, obviously, because this timing I get is actually similar to what I'll be getting on 8x8s, and also there are quite a number of crazy center pop problems that happen in this solve itself. But I would say that if you're not aggressively trying to spam this cube and get a good timing on it, you're just casually turning it and handling the cube relatively gently, I don't think this should be that serious of an issue. Plus, like, overall, I don't think the 3D print plastic quality is going to match up to that of a mass-produced puzzle. It also does have the ability to make quite a handful of claims, including the maglev 7x7, to which maglev big cubes are actually not that difficult to design. All you need to do is make that middle shaft big enough to put a pair of ring magnets inside, and some ring magnet sets like the one that you put inside the MGC Square one are already quite small. The really difficult one is a maglev even cube, where I have to engineer my own alignment mechanism for that, because the standard alignment mechanism like has different sets of contact points compared to your spring and screw. But overall, this 7x7 does work as a nice display piece, and I do like how it looks, and just to show its full functionality as a proportional 7x7 as a maglev 7x7, I do think it gets the job done.